Hi students, welcome to Unit 3, Lesson 1. This is Developmental Psychology. We will do a little intro. We'll also talk about motor and perceptual development in children. Our objectives look like this. We'll explain the interaction of environmental and biological factors in development, including the role of the brain, and key features of physical development from prenatal to older adulthood. It all starts with conception. So developmental psychology studies physical, cognitive, and social change from conception to death. And they use three different arguments to make that assessment to study. So is it nature versus nurture, biology versus our environment? Are we who we are because of stability versus change? Is our relationship stable? Relationships and environment stable? And another one is continuity and stages. So these different perspectives allow us a different lens to study our own development and other development. We will talk a lot about certain psychologists who focus on stages, and some who focus on continuity, and some who focus on stability and change. Ultimately, we will discuss mostly nature and nurture. So conception is where our life force begins. It is a process of the sperm finding the egg, and that amazing process is something that I'll share with you in video in class. And we become this once we are conceived. So initially, our zygote is the fertilized egg, which develops if all of the factors of its existence are proper, are nurtured. It enters a 2-week period of rapid division of cells and develops into an embryo. So by 9 weeks, this zygote becomes an embryo. After 2 weeks, it becomes an embryo. And then the embryo, as you can see, kind of resembles a human being. So this is the developing human being, 9-week fetus. We would recognize at 9 weeks a baby as a baby, the developing human organism from 9 weeks after conception to birth. Now that environment, that womb, the uterus, has to be conducive to supporting the life of a healthy baby in order for it to advance into zygote to embryo stages. When a baby is born, its physical development revolves around innate abilities to do certain tasks. And these tasks primarily are based on survival. So our first set of reflexes, innate instinctual things that we're born with, includes the grasping reflex. And they believe that this is left over from evolutionary time period when a child had to grab onto its caregivers just for survival. So grasping reflex, you put something in a baby's hand and they're going to hold on to it for dear life. So rooting reflex is the response of you touch the baby on its cheek and it's going to try to put that finger in its mouth. So responding to anything touching it's around their mouth. The Moro reflex is flinching when falling backward, and then Babinski, when you touch a baby on its feet, it'll go like this, which is kind of cool. Like I said, I'll show you all of these in action when we get to class. Now you see here babies that are standing, walking, crawling, sitting up, and that is part of our physical motor development. So maturation is an internally programmed and sequential growth of a child. We are able to, if you start from the top and work your way down, sit, lift our chin, lift our head, rolled over, sit with support, sit without support, so on. This is all the stages, the subsequent stages that children should be developing into if all things are proper in their environment. So it takes both an internal maturation sequence and also the proper learning environment. This is a combination of nature and nurture. Without the two, a baby might have trouble learning how to walk. These amazing things, these maturational milestones, are things that we take for granted today because, we don't have to give any thought to walking. But at one time in your life, you actually did. You had to think about balancing and movement and coordination. So the rest of our life, we don't have to spend time thinking about how do I coordinate my physical abilities. This is kind of mind-blowing stuff. Our brain is a large part of this, of course, because the frontal lobe from the ages of 3 to 6 is a time period of the most rapid growth in our lifetimes. It is a time of where we're learning about rational planning. And you have a mouse pictured here because there are scientists who have taken mice and separated them from other mice and raised them solitary versus those that are around other mice. And they find that the growth and development of the frontal lobe is enhanced by stimulating the environment. So you have to have social interaction and support in order for your frontal lobe to develop as well as it can, because otherwise you miss a critical period of your development. And one person who did that was Jeannie. If you recall her capabilities, once she was found as a teenager, she didn't have much ability to communicate what was going on with her. So the critical period, especially for Jeannie, that is demonstrated is one of language development. That age period from 3 to 6 is the time when our frontal lobes are forming all those neural networks and beautiful connections and super highways of communications. And she missed out on that because of her being locked away. Now, break from motor development, language development, over to perceptual development. So perceptual development is when an infant learns to make sense from sights, sounds, tastes, and other things. So imagine, like I've used an example in class before, like the first time you tasted a strawberry, you had to be told what that was. You knew it was something that you enjoyed, but you had to be told what it was. Here in this picture, so you see that there are two different pictures. The one on the left looks more like a human face than the one on the right. The one on the right would be confusing for a child. The child, I'm talking like 9 months old, is going to stare more at the one that looks more like a face, because that's what their world is right now, is looking up at mom who is breastfeeding. So they're going to focus more on the faces side of things rather than the gobbledygook side of things. That it doesn't make sense for them. The perceptual development, what I'm talking about here is how we perceive the environment. How do we make sense of it? Well, we work that out in these early stages of our development. And we see here eyesight is not fully developed until 5 to 10 weeks, and we prefer face patterns. We saw that with baby Robert. Baby Robert, remember, his vision was a little bit weird, is what the author of that video talks about. The narrator, he says everything's a little bit weird. So he has to have the neural capacity to be able to recognize forms and features and all the different things that he's encountering throughout his lifetime. Remember the checkerboard, he's staring at the checkerboard because that was something that repeated. It was a repetitive pattern that allowed him to make sense of the world. Final thoughts on perceptual development. The first times that we taste things like chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, we like those. Like, we have a natural inclination to things that are sweet and savory. For children, you know, even more. Sweet, savory, and salty are things that you probably prefer more than I do. More on depth perception in class. I'll show you this video. So one of the ways that we learn about the environment is through that maturation of crawling and walking and such. So you can't expect a child to be able to walk and run before it has crawled. And part of the natural crawling process is learning about depth perception. This is demonstrated in a experiment known as the visual cliff. And the visual cliff is where a child who has not been crawling for very long will be willing to crawl directly off of a cliff. Now, they do this in controlled environments. But then a child who's been crawling for a while knows that if I fall while I'm crawling, I'm going to get hurt. So they have had the benefit of painful events to tell them that they are in danger. So by around 9 months, especially when a child learns to crawl, we're learning about depth perception. Otherwise, before that, it might just look a little bit 2D. As I mentioned with perceptual development, hearing is usually better developed than our eyesight. I mentioned preferring sweet and strong smells over some other tastes. All right, that's a quick look at perceptual and motor development. It would not be ideal for a parent to expect a child to begin walking at 6 months old, especially if they've not even stood on their own. So no rushing that. To explain the interaction of environmental and biological factors in development is to understand that the nature and nurture are intertwined in our development, and we have to be fed, clothed, and all of that in order to properly have our genetics kick in. And key features of physical development include things like the visual cliff experiment, which we'll get more information on.